So lately, I've been doing a series of shorts about the forgotten heroes of comic book lore.
Yeah, golden age of comics.
The golden age, right? So in my research, I came across a character called Lion Man. Now, Lion Man, he was just a name on a list when I first looked it up. But it turns out he has a really important place in comic book history. It turns out that Lion Man was the very first black superhero. The very first African-American superhero.
What year was that?
He came out in 1947.
Interesting.
Now, it's a long time ago. Now, most people think Black Panther is the first black superhero, created in 1966 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby.
First appeared in Fantastic Four.
Fantastic Four number 52, I believe. Right? 52.
Yeah. Actually sold it about 7 or 8 years ago.
Really?
Uh-huh.
That must be good. So, Lion Man actually predates him by almost 20 years. And he appeared in a comic book that the history of which is even more interesting than the fact that there's a forgotten black superhero that nobody, well, not nobody, but
I would
lots
think
of
most people
don't know about.
Most people who collect comics or who know about comic book history do not know about Lion Man.
Right. So, Lion Man first appeared in a comic called All Negro Comics number 1, which came out in June of 1947. It was created by a journalist named Orrin Cromwell Evans. He worked for a paper called the Philadelphia Record. He was actually the only black writer on an all-white paper.
So we're talking about Philadelphia again being a hot spot for something to deal with the birth of comics.
Comics or sci-fi. Yeah, Philly was a real big city for this. Now, Orrin Cromwell Evans, he is a journalist again at the Philadelphia Record. He's the only black journalist there. He leaves when the paper closes down, and he wants to sort of further the cause of black identity. He wants to be a champion for black people in the arts. So what he does is he creates a comic book company, and he calls it All Negro Comics Incorporated. Now, what made this different is that every single person working for All Negro Comics was an African American. Black writers, black artists, the editor-in-chief, Evans himself, black. Everybody involved was an African American.
I would think that throughout the industry at that point, there was nobody else who was African American working for
very few,
working for Marvel, working for DC at the time.
No, I don't think there was anybody in Marvel.
I would think
in
not.
Timely or DC or Fawcett or any of those.
It was probably no women working at that time either. It was probably all white men working for the. And it was at that 1947. There was a lot of comic books being published in 1947.
So he teamed up with someone named Bill Driscoll and Harry T. Saylor, who helped him get the company together and put out number 1. Like I said, June 1947. It's really early.
Really early.
Before the civil rights movement gets going. Even.
I mean, that's really early in the United States at that time.
Yeah.
We're just coming out of World War II, right?
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Comic books are really coming back at that point.
Right.
We're getting away from superheroes, though, right?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing. The first issue of the comic book, it was an anthology, of course, like most comics.
Like Action
Comics
at that time,
and all those, And it was actually 48 pages, which is long. And it sold for 15 cents, not 12, like most comics. Or 10.
And
maybe 10 back
sold on newsstands.
Sold on newsstands, but actually, there are no clear figures on how wide distribution was. And they don't have any idea of how many copies were actually sold. But for them, it was successful enough for them to have started putting together the second issue, right?
Okay. So they made money on it. If they were getting ready for a second issue, there was money.
If they were preparing for a second issue, then yes, that means they made money, right? So the 48 pages contained a bunch of different features. One was called Ace Harlem, which was about a private detective in New York City's Harlem at the time. Really interesting story, very hard-boiled detective. At the time, he was considered to be the kind of flagship character.
Okay.
Ace Harlem was going to be the one that took them through the whole series. Then there was something called The Little Do Dillies, which was about a bunch of sort of cherubic characters who only babies could see. It was kind of like a funny animals comic, something like that, right? Then you have Ezekiel's Manhunt, which is a boy's adventure story. You had Lion Man and Bubba. That's the superhero story.
Bubba?
And we'll get back to who that is in a little bit.
Looking forward to it.
Mm-hmm. Then there was a humor feature called Hep Chicks on Parade, which is about women dressed up in really trendy clothing, kind of making fun of trends.
Hep Chicks or Hip Chicks?
Well, Hep was the original word.
Okay.
Hip Chicks came later.
Interesting.
Hep Chicks on Parade.
Chicks.
Then there was a humor feature, a lot like Andy Cap apparently, called Lil Eggy. about a character named Egbert, who was this sort of henpecked husband.
Is Andy Cap out at this point?
I think so, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to look that
1947.
up. 1947. Yep. Then there's a feature called Sugarfoot, which featured two characters, Sugarfoot and Snake Oil, who were these traveling salesmen / minstrels.
And all of these stories take place in the 1940s? Like
No, some are in the past.
Okay.
Like, I think Sugarfoot and Snake Oil was in the past, in the late 1800s. Then it ended with a PSA. Crime doesn't pay.
Okay.
A public service announcement from the editors. And it even included a preview of issue number 2, featuring some panels that would be coming up in the next Ace Harlem story.
Interesting.
Right. So again, if they were starting to put together issue 2, they had already made money from the distributors, right? Then something really weird happens. Just before they go to print on number 2, they can't get any of the ink or newspaper that they need to print issue 2. No one will sell it to them all of a sudden. And distributors drop the comic from any of their distribution rights. Now, there's no proof. There's no actual proof. No, there's no real solid proof. But a lot of people theorize and infer that because of Lion Man, and we'll talk about this in a minute, nobody wanted to pick up issue 2 of All Negro Comics.
Why?
Because in the story of Lion Man, you have a black superhero beating up white villains. And they think that the racists at the time reacted very, very poorly to it. Also, it could be that it sold well enough in and around Philadelphia that Fawcett may have gotten nervous about more competition from these artists because they were getting ready to put out their own all-black comic. Not black creators, by the way, but comic aimed at a black audience.
So there was enough of an audience at that time for Fawcett, one of the big publishers, to create their own black-centric comic book.
Right. And the theory is that Fawcett may have pressured distributors not to distribute the next issue.
And they would have had the power because they were huge. They were producing a lot more, and if they threatened to pull their production from them, then no one's going to go against them at that point. You got a little tiny publisher who's publishing one comic book against the giant, one of the giants at the time.
Exactly. So, again, there's no solid evidence that these were the reasons.
How do I not know this story before?
It's kind of incredible, isn't it? Yeah. I didn't know it.
And I know a lot about comics.
I was just going to do a 1-minute short on Lion Man, and I stumbled into this. Yeah. Now, Evans, after the collapse of All Negro Comics, he went back into journalism. He passed away in 1971. He worked as a newspaper journalist his whole life. Now, let's talk specifically about Lion Man. This was a really interesting character. Lion Man was a scientist, an African-American scientist, sent from America to Africa to guard something called the Magic Mountain in Africa.
Okay.
The Magic Mountain was a uranium deposit that the UN wanted to make sure no one would go near to make nuclear weapons or any of this stuff. Right? A secret resource, Magic Mountain in Africa, a black superhero who's protecting it.
He's a cat.
Lion Man. Yeah, it all kind of does sound familiar. Now, again, there's no proof that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were thinking of Lion Man when they created Black Panther. But both of them were active in the 1940s in comics. And, people borrowed from each other. And maybe they borrowed from it without even realizing.
We can't ask anyone at this point because everyone involved is deceased.
Yeah. Now, this brings us to, are there existing issues? Existing issues of All Negro Comics #1 are really, really, really hard to come by. Most of them are terribly damaged.
Were there any on eBay?
I couldn't find anything on eBay. But there are tons of PDFs online, so you can go on and read.
Oh, you actually can read the stories? You can read
the stories if you want to. But there's a lot of PDFs online. But a lot of the existing issues are sort of crumbling and coming to pieces at this point. I couldn't even find how much one would be worth if you had it.
And you can't, and you don't have any kind of distribution, so you don't really know how far it was distributed, if it was only localized to the Philadelphia area.
Right.
So you really don't know.
Yeah, there's no distribution numbers, there's no sales numbers, we really don't know how many copies were put out originally.
Stay tuned for a short. We might do a short on, maybe we'll find out some more on what it's worth, on how many there might be in existence, if there's any graded versions. We'll do some more research on this.
And one of the amazing things is, it actually gives us a hint at something that could have existed. If they had been allowed to go to number 2, if they had been prevented from creating number 2, there could have been an alternate run of comics running alongside mainstream comics, specifically aimed at African-American audiences. There were comics aimed at African-American audiences at the time, but this would have been the only one done by all black artists and all black writers and all black editors, which would have been something to see. I mean, we kind of missed out on a alternate history of comics in a lot of ways.
The thing with comics history too is, if you don't know, is that Stan Lee as a figure in comics was very anti-racist. Stan Lee was very pro-black at the time, at a time when most people weren't, and that's why the Black Panther comes about. That's the whole. The X-Men is basically about racism
and homophobia,
right? And he didn't have any ill will towards anybody, Stan Lee.
Right. So I just want to throw in here just with this idea of what could have been. I want to read to you Orrin Cromwell Evans' editorial message that started, that was printed at the beginning of All Negro Comics #1, talking about his aims for it. And I'm just going to read it because I don't want to mess it up.
He doesn't want to mess it up. He wants
I want to make sure it's exact. Yeah.
He doesn't want to paraphrase.
He started it with, "Dear readers, this is the first issue of All Negro Comics, jam-packed with fast action, African adventure, good clean humor, and fantasy. Every brushstroke and pen line in the drawings on these pages are by Negro artists. This publication is another milestone in the splendid history of Negro journalism. All Negro Comics will not only give Negro artists an opportunity gainfully to use their talents, but it will glorify Negro historical achievements."
So I think we could take a leap and say too that he was a comic book fan.
He was a comic book fan?
And saw comic books as a means to empower the black community at the time, which is, I mean, in 1947,
was way ahead of his time.
Way ahead of his time.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it. It's kind of an incredible history. There's a lot of other stuff to look up about it. And if you're curious about what the art looked like, it's up there in quality as far as Action Comics.
Yeah, you can check it out online, right? You can actually look at it online. If anybody owns a copy of this, drop us a comment.
Yeah, let us know if you've ever seen a copy.
Right, if you ever gone to a convention, if you actually own one yourself. Love to hear if anyone has this in their collection.
Yeah. So that's it for now. It's just kind of an interesting,
that was a good
somewhat amazing historical.
This was a good historical lesson.
Yeah.
I know a lot about comics. I had never heard about
it
before.
either. Yeah. So look it up, see what you think, and comment if you found anything or you know anything that we don't know or something we missed in the video.
We'd love to hear more about this.
Absolutely. So like, subscribe, and until then,
love what you collect.
Collect what you love.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.